It began quietly, like most disasters do, not with explosions or revolutions, but with signatures on paper, flickering screens, and a collective delusion that numbers could never lie. It was the early 2000s, the dawn of an age that worshiped credit as if it were divine. People didn't pray in temples anymore. They prayed at banks. And the new religion promised salvation through ownership, houses, cars, dreams you could live inside. They called it prosperity. But it was something else. A mirage, shimmering over the desert of human greed. For generations, societies have believed that growth can continue forever, that the line on the graph can always go up. And every time, that belief has ended the same way. In panic, collapse, and disbelief, the Great Recession of 2008 wasn't the first fall. It was merely the most televised. The story begins with homes, the simplest symbol of safety. But safety turned into speculation, and speculation became obsession. Banks lent money to anyone with a pulse. Wall Street packaged those promises into glittering boxes of paper, sold them to the world, and called them assets. It was an empire built not on stone, but on confidence. And confidence is the most fragile material known to man. The thesis of this story is simple. When humans forget that wealth is a story and not a fact, they build castles in clouds. And when reality arrives, those castles become graves. In ancient Rome, farmers mortgaged their land to fight endless wars. In 18th century France, kings printed money backed by nothing but hope. In 1929, the same faith in infinite growth collapsed overnight, turning millionaires into beggars. History repeats. Not because people don't know the past, but because they think this time is different. By 2004, America had convinced itself that housing prices could never fall. It was a perfect fantasy. Everyone could be rich, as long as everyone kept borrowing. A rising tide that would lift all boats, even those already sinking. Banks invented complex names for simple greed. Collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, credit default swaps. Each sounded like the language of geniuses, but it was the same trick repeated. Take something rotten, wrap it in gold, and sell it before it smells. In that sense, the Great Recession wasn't born in Wall Street towers. It was born in living rooms, open houses, and TV ads telling Americans, "You deserve more. Don't wait. Own it now." Desire became policy, and debt became patriotism. This is where the pattern begins, the historical rhythm that never dies, when optimism turns arrogance, when innovation becomes indulgence, when systems meant to protect start to prey. It happened in the Gilded Age, when railroads inflated bubbles that shattered banks. It happened in Japan's lost decade, when property values tripled and then vanished. And it happened again in 2008, when humanity forgot that progress has limits. The system was simple and suicidal. Banks lent money to home buyers. Those loans were bundled into safe investments. Investors bought them with borrowed money. Insurance companies promised protection they couldn't afford. Everyone was tied to everyone else, a spiderweb woven from debt and faith. Then came the first crack. Interest rates rose. Homeowners defaulted, and the machine that had printed wealth for a decade began to choke on its own illusions. But no one stopped. They couldn't. When your salary, your pension, your government all depend on the lie continuing, you pray the lie stays alive a little longer. The collapse was inevitable. It was never about one company, one CEO, or one bad loan. It was about a civilization that believed the price of everything could rise forever, that risk could be engineered away, that consequences were negotiable. And then, one September morning in 2008, the illusion died. Lehman Brothers fell. Markets froze. The world held its breath. To the ordinary person, it looked like chaos. To history, it looked like déjà vu. Modern economists called it the Great Recession. But the truth is simpler. It was the Great Reminder. A reminder that even the smartest systems are run by human hearts. The same hearts that fear missing out more than they fear collapse. Government stepped in with money they didn't have. Trillions were printed to stop the bleeding. And the printing never really stopped. The cure became the new disease. This is where the modern phase begins, a world addicted to stimulus, unable to function without artificial support. The patient survived, but only by being kept on life support forever. Zero interest rates, quantitative easing, a decade of easy money that inflated new bubbles in tech, in crypto, in everything. The future didn't fix the past. It disguised it. Now, as we stand years later, we see the same symptoms returning. Rising debt, speculative mania, blind faith in algorithms instead of gods. But the rhythm hasn't changed. Only the instruments. A child could understand the logic. If you keep borrowing from tomorrow to live today, eventually tomorrow runs out. That's the invisible line every empire crosses right before it falls. The Great Recession wasn't just an economic event. It was a mirror. It showed us who we are when we believe we've outsmarted nature. And that belief, the idea that humans can escape the gravity of consequence, is the oldest illusion on Earth. Look at the world today. Housing prices higher than ever. Debt higher than ever. A generation raised to believe that crash is an outdated word. We learn nothing, or maybe we learned the wrong lesson. That if you print enough money, no one has to pay the price. But history doesn't forget. It waits, it watches, and it always collects its debts. The Great Recession wasn't the end. It was rehearsal. The real collapse comes when the world runs out of faith. Not dollars, because money is only paper. But belief is the glue that holds civilization together. And belief, once broken, cannot be printed back. That's where we stand now, in the quiet space between bubbles. A silence that feels safe, but isn't. The same silence Rome felt before inflation devoured its coins. The same silence before 1929, before 2008, before the next storm. The signs are already here. Speculation disguised as innovation. Debt disguised as opportunity. Confidence disguised as stability. And somewhere, deep down, we all know how the story ends. Because we've seen it before. And we'll see it again. The economy isn't math. It's memory. And memory always repeats itself until the lesson is finally learned. But humanity never listens until it's too late. That's why this story matters. Not as history, but as prophecy. Because the next recession won't begin in the markets. It will begin in the mind, when people stop believing that numbers mean anything at all. When the dust finally settled, the world pretended to breathe again. Politicians stepped onto stages, smiling beneath exhausted lights, promising that the worst was over. Television anchors declared recovery. Charts began to rise. And humanity did what it always does after disaster. It convinced itself that the fire had been a cleansing one, that something had been learned, that next time would be different. But the truth was darker. The system didn't heal. It adapted. It mutated into something new, more efficient, more deceptive, a machine that could inflate wealth without producing anything real. And this time, the air that filled the bubble wasn't hope. It was money printed out of nothing. Central banks became gods. They spoke in the calm, priest-like tone of men who control fate itself. Quantitative easing, they called it, a term so abstract that few understood it meant manufacturing trillions of dollars from thin air. Interest rates dropped to near zero. The cost of borrowing disappeared. And suddenly, risk didn't feel like risk anymore. What began as emergency medicine became daily addiction. Every time markets trembled, more money was printed. Every time growth slowed, the patient was sedated with credit. A generation was born that never saw pain as part of the process. To them, the economy was a video game that could always be reset. Banks borrowed for free. Corporations borrowed for free. Governments borrowed for free. Even people with no savings learned they could borrow their way into the illusion of success. Debt stopped being a warning. It became a way of life. The great irony is that the cure to the Great Recession became the seed of the next one, because every dollar printed without labor behind it dilutes trust. And trust, once diluted, doesn't evaporate, it rots. During the 2010s, the new religion was innovation. The prophets were young, charismatic, and armed with code instead of cash. Startups promised to reinvent everything. Transport, medicine, currency, even happiness itself. Investors threw billions at dreams written on napkins. The line went up again. Only this time, it wasn't houses. It was apps, tokens, and data. We called it the digital revolution. But it was still the same pattern in a different costume. Speculation wearing the mask of progress. Mania disguised as genius. The world wanted heroes, and Silicon Valley provided them. Men in black t-shirts became philosophers. Companies became cults. And the promise was intoxicating, that technology could end scarcity itself. That we had entered a post-economic era where imagination replaced production. But every utopia demands a sacrifice. To build this one, we traded privacy for convenience, humanity for speed, and stability for infinite growth once again. Data became the new mortgage, something everyone gave away, certain it would always rise in value. Governments watched in awe as corporations grew larger than nations. Algorithms began deciding what people saw, bought, believed. And all the while, central banks kept the forward drip running. Cheap money, endless credit, the quiet heartbeat of a system that refused to feel pain. Then came the side effects. Wages stagnated while assets exploded. A small percentage of people owned everything that could be owned. The rest borrowed to survive. For them, recovery was a myth, a fairy tale told in financial channels they couldn't afford to watch. Inequality widened not because anyone planned it, but because the math demanded it. When money is free, those who already have it multiply. Those who don't drown. By the mid-2010s, a new phrase appeared. The everything bubble. Stocks, bonds, property, art, crypto, all rising together, all dependent on the same oxygen. And deep down, everyone knew oxygen runs out. But humanity was too distracted. The screens were too bright. The dopamine too sweet. Then 2020 arrived, and history whispered again. A pandemic froze the world. Supply chains snapped. Markets trembled. And once more, the answer was the same. Print. Governments unleashed more stimulus in months than the world had printed in decades. Helicopter money. Direct checks. Corporate rescues. Digital liquidity flowing faster than logic. The printer became the only god left. It sounded a new lullaby of civilization. For a while it worked. Markets soared to record highs even as cities were silent. The digital economy consumed the real one. Work migrated to screens. Consumption became isolation. And somewhere inside that silence, inflation began to wake. At first, economists called it transitory. They always do. But inflation is not a visitor. It's a verdict, a delayed reaction to arrogance. Too much money chasing too few things. It's the oldest story on Earth. By 2021, prices rose faster than memory. Governments blamed supply chains. Corporations blamed energy. But the truth was simpler. We had borrowed the future again, and the future wanted it back. Then came the correction. Interest rates climbed. The free money ended. And the world remembered what gravity feels like. Tech giants shed trillions in value. Startups vanished overnight. Crypto empires dissolved like mirages in the sun. The same people who once preached infinite growth now spoke of efficiency and discipline, the last words of every collapsing empire. But beneath the chaos, something deeper was changing. The faith that had held the system together began to fracture. For the first time, people questioned not just the numbers, but the narrative. If governments could print endless money, why pay taxes? If banks could be rescued from failure, why trust risk? If the system rewards speculation, why work at all? And that is the true aftermath of the Great Recession. Not economic, but moral decay. A slow corrosion of belief in fairness, effort, and truth. The 20th century taught humanity to fear depression. The 21st taught it to fear deflation. But the next century will fear disbelief. A world where money no longer means anything because everyone knows it's just code. That's the world being born now. Currencies turning digital. Central banks designing control through ones and zeros. Inflation weaponized as silent taxation. A system rebuilt not to prevent collapse, but to manage it forever. People call it progress. But progress built on illusion is just a countdown. Every chart, every cycle, every empire in human history follows the same curve. A rise fueled by faith, a peak blinded by pride and a fall triggered by truth. We are now between the second and the third. The tragedy of the Great Recession wasn't that it happened. It's that it was forgotten. In the name of recovery, we sowed the seeds of repetition. We created a generation allergic to consequence, addicted to comfort, and convinced that someone, somewhere, can always press reset. But there is no reset button on reality. There is only time, and time collects interest on every unpaid debt. We are now living in the echo of a collapse disguised as prosperity. And the louder the celebration, the closer the silence that follows. Because history is not a straight line, it's a pendulum, and it always swings back to balance. You can already feel it. In the unease of markets, in the skepticism of youth, in the quiet realization that something vast and invisible is cracking beneath our feet. The decade that pretended to recover was never recovery. It was anesthesia, a pause before the next contraction. And now, the patient is waking up. The question isn't if the system will correct. It's how much of the illusion will survive afterward. Every empire believes it can engineer eternity. None ever have. And this one, the digital, debt-driven empire of data and dopamine, is no exception. The numbers are rising again. The speeches sound the same. The graphs climb upward into clouds. But look closer. The cracks are already there, spiderwebbing through the foundation. You can't see them on television. You can feel them in rent, in wages, in the cost of survival. The numbers say recovery. Reality says decline. That's how it always begins, with denial wrapped in data. The world calls it resilience. History calls it repetition. And somewhere deep in the archives of time, the same story waits to be told again. Different names, same ending. The age that began with houses and ended with hashtags is nearing its final chapter. And the lesson, once again, is unchanged. No system built on debt, distraction, and denial can last forever. The next phase has already begun, quiet, invisible, mathematical. And when the music stops this time, there will be no bailout big enough, no narrative bright enough to hide the truth, because the truth doesn't crash overnight. It erodes, slowly, silently, until one morning, the world wakes up and realizes the wealth it believed and was never really there. And that morning is coming. They say history never repeats. But it does. It only changes its costume. And today, the costume is digital. The next collapse won't begin in the stock market. It will begin in the code, in invisible algorithms trading faster than thought, in currencies without faces, values without weight, and systems that no longer need human permission to fail. The Great Recession was a financial crisis. The next one will be existential. For centuries, money was paper. Before that, metal. Before that, faith. Now it's data, floating across servers that no one truly owns, watched by machines that no one fully understands. We call it efficiency, but it's control disguised as progress. Artificial intelligence is replacing decision with automation, judgment with prediction. The market no longer needs people to panic. It can do that on its own. A world once ruled by human greed is now ruled by machine logic, and that logic obeys one rule above all: optimization. To optimize is to remove inefficiency. And in an economy built on consumption, inefficiency means you. The same system that created abundance will decide who is unnecessary to sustain it. Jobs vanish quietly, not through revolutions but through updates. Entire professions fade overnight, erased by software updates no one voted for. And yet, the illusion of growth continues. Numbers rise. Charts soar. People scroll. We've entered a new kind of recession, not of money but of meaning. When everything becomes faster, cheaper, and more efficient, purpose becomes obsolete. Human value becomes a rounding error. But every empire of illusion meets the same ending. The Roman Empire printed coins until the metal lost its worth. The British Empire borrowed until the world stopped lending. The American Empire is now printing trust in digital form, believing it can outsmart the physics of consequence. But consequence is patient. It waits. A digital currency controlled by the few. A population distracted by endless entertainment. A generation drowning in information but starving for truth. This isn't science fiction. It's the blueprint of our age. When the next crash comes, it won't just erase savings. It will erase certainty. People will question what money is, what value means, and what future still exists when the system itself is synthetic. Some will call it the Great Reset. But resets are not beginnings. They are the last act of denial before collapse. The signs are already visible. Quiet runs on banks. Currencies inflated into absurdity. Nations competing to control the flow of digital cash. Debt has become a global language, spoken fluently by every government that pretends to manage it. But debt is not management. It's surrender disguised as policy. Every graph still climbs upward. Every leader still promises growth. But the lines are bending, softly, almost imperceptibly, toward the same horizon they always reach, decline. Because the economy is not infinite. It's a mirror reflecting human behavior. And as long as greed outweighs wisdom, the reflection will remain distorted. You can already feel it in the smallest things. The price of food, the weight of rent, the quiet fatigue behind every smiling politician saying, everything is fine. It's the same script, rewritten for a new era, and the same ending, approaching faster than anyone admits. But collapse is not destruction. It's revelation. It strips away the illusions and shows what was always true, that no civilization can borrow its way to immortality, that no system built on lies can sustain truth forever, and that every age of abundance is secretly preparing its own reckoning. The question is not if it will happen again. It's when we'll realize it already has. Maybe it started the moment we traded attention for convenience. Maybe it began when we turned creation into content, value into views, and labor into likes. Maybe the Great Recession never really ended. It just changed form, hiding in the glow of our screens. The next collapse won't destroy skyscrapers. It will destroy illusions, the idea that we can consume endlessly, print infinitely, and live without consequence. And when it happens, it will feel sudden, though it was always coming. The warning signs were never hidden. We simply stopped looking. And that is why understanding matters now more than ever. Because knowledge is the only currency that doesn't inflate. If you felt that quiet unease, that sense that something enormous and invisible is shifting beneath the world, you're not paranoid. You're paying attention. The patterns are there. They've always been there. Rising, falling, repeating, until someone finally learns. But most won't. They'll scroll past, laugh at history, and trust that someone else will fix it. And those are the people who always get crushed by the cycle. The purpose of this channel isn't to predict the future. It's to remember it, to decode the economy not as numbers, but as human nature, the same nature that built every empire and buried every one of them. So before the next illusion begins, before the next bubble inflates, before the next generation is told, this time is different. Remember what you've heard. The Great Recession was not an event. It was a warning. And the warning is repeating. If you want to see what happens next, to understand the patterns before they strike again, to witness history while it's still being written, then don't just watch. Subscribe to the Economy Code, because when the next collapse begins, you'll want to recognize the sound.